Hey guys, coming at you from quarantine, like I think we all are. And I just thought this would be a good time to start putting out more content and answering more of your guys' questions so we can all keep learning during this mandated downtime. So today, I want to talk about something that I've gotten a lot of questions on over the years and something that we've all dealt with in ourselves or with the people around us. Some of you are training clients. And if you are training clients with weightlifting, you will encounter this at some point or another, I guarantee it. And there's still a lot of uncertainty about it out there. So, what we're talking about today is butt wink. So, what is butt wink? The wink part refers to like that motion of an eyelid closing, except in this case it refers to the pelvis. So, it's usually squats, but it can be other exercises as well, like deadlifts. But we'll just stick to squats for today. And that winking motion is the pelvis. So as they go down into the hole of a squat, that pelvis winks or tucks under them, and sometimes that's accompanied by rounding of the lower back. So if we define it from an anatomical physiological standpoint, what's actually going on is a posterior tilting of the pelvis, accompanied sometimes by flexion of the lumbar spine. Is it bad? Sort of. It's hard to put a blanket statement over something as multifactorial and diverse as this. I think it's more of an individual case by case basis you need to analyze it on, but sometimes it can be bad, and you need to ask yourself some questions. Does this individual that you're analyzing, do they get into a bad position during their squat because of the wink? And by that I mean, does their pelvis posteriorly tilt so much that it does cause flexion of the lumbar spine past what you would call a neutral range that you deem acceptable for squatting? Because if so, then yes, that does need correcting, because as we know, a flexed lumbar spine under load is a mechanism of injury, be it via disc herniation or just a strain of the lower back. It's not something that you necessarily want to train people in under load, under heavy load at least. So if they get into a bad position, then yeah, you want to correct that. But if it's more subtle than that, like if there is some movement going on in the lower back or the hips, but they never actually get into a bad position. So if you freeze the video and look at the bottom of their squat and they're still within a neutral range, but there has been some movement going on, I'd say it's probably not necessarily a dangerous position or a bad habit that needs correcting so that they don't hurt themselves. They don't have to avoid it. You know what I mean? But I would say it's probably inefficient for getting as strong as possible, because when you have movement going on under that heavy load, it's just inefficient, right? What you have is an energy leak going on, and they're not going to be as strong and stable as they could be because there's movement going on where you don't want it to be. So that's something that could still be corrected, even if it's not necessarily dangerous. So now let's dive into why does it happen? And obviously there's a lot of reasons for this. Easiest one is going to be mobility, right? In powerlifting, we have to hit a certain depth where your hip has to drop below your knee, right? And weightlifting, people squat even lower. And in general population, if you're training people, typically you like to see them squat to a depth that you're familiar with. And you can get around this a lot of time in general population if they don't need to squat that low anyway. But I think personally, your client should have the ability to squat this low safely, even if you choose not to, barring some kind of pathological injury or something like that. So that range of motion needs to come from somewhere. And ideally, it's going to come from the ankle and the hip joint, having sufficient not only mobility, but strength at end range or stability to carry out these movements. Now, a squat is a triple flexion. You hear about triple extension a lot, which refers to the hip, knee, and ankle extending at the same time, whereas like in a jump. Whereas a squat is exactly the opposite of that. All three of those joints are flexing, going into flexion at the same time. So, and the ankle, that would be dorsiflexion specifically. So what happens a lot of the time, especially with low bar squats, is that people start in a bad or disadvantageous position for a triple flexion. And what I mean by that is there's sort of two camps, right? There's people that have been coached poorly, and there's people that haven't been coached at all, but they sort of wind up in the same place, even though some of it's intentional and some of it's not. But if people are just trying out low bar, that weight is so far behind their normal center of mass that they compensate for it by sort of picking their chest up and anteriorly tilting their pelvis to sort of just find balance, right? But that results in an anteriorly tilted pelvis and then a lot of tension or tone in the muscles of the lower back, like the spinal erectors, right? And so the problem with that is at some point that pelvis is going to need to re-enter a neutral range if you're going to hit depth, almost all the time. So that pelvis is going to need to tuck relative to the starting position that that person found, and those erectors are going to have to relax in order to hit the depth that that person wants to hit, competition depth, for example. So in this case, that's the difference between a posteriorly tilted pelvis and a posteriorly tilting pelvis, because as that person descends and that hip has and the pelvis has to tuck under, it's posteriorly tilting, but if it never ends up in a bad position, it's not a posteriorly tilted pelvis, it's just gone into neutral. So that's the difference. While you might not necessarily want to squat with a posteriorly tilted pelvis, some posterior tilting to get back into a neutral range isn't inherently dangerous. Like I said, it might just be inefficient. So what I'll do in that case is have people a lot of the time just start at the bottom or get into the bottom, find that position that they naturally have to be in anyway at the bottom with a neutral or slightly posteriorly tilted pelvis and those knees forward, and try to maintain that at the top, because people seem to screw it up right out of the gate, right? That's where you anteriorly tilt, is right at the top. So if you can find a good position before you descend, you're going to see a lot less movement going on and a lot more maintenance of a neutral, stable position of the low back and pelvis. And hand in hand with that is a lot of butt wink issues get caused by poor bracing or an inability to create good intra-abdominal pressure, because that's everything, right? If you can create good pressure through the obliques, the rectus abdominis, into the lower back, you've stabilized that trunk, and you're going to be preventing a lot of that motion going on, that rounding through the lumbar spine. So those bracing drills, which I'll get into later, that a lot of you guys are familiar with, that's a lot of the reason behind it, right? And some of it also can come from just poor cueing. So you might have heard some coaches say to sit back right away, and I think that is partially a cause of this sometimes. So when you sit back instead of sitting straight down between your feet, I think that sort of biases you into an anterior pelvic tilt, because the first thing you want to do is shoot those hips backward. That pelvis just naturally comes forward, and butt wink sometimes results from that. So that's just something to keep in mind. And that goes hand in hand with not letting the knees come forward, or the knees not being able to come forward because of poor, usually ankle mobility. But either way, if those knees aren't coming forward, it's a lot more stress on that pelvis and that lower back, shear force. So let's just get into some fixes for that, right? So bracing drills, number one, that's the first place you should probably start with someone who's having butt wink issues, especially bracing drills in a posteriorly tilted position or a neutral pelvic position, and those involving the hamstrings and adductors, right? So if someone can find stability and a good brace utilizing the hamstrings and adductors to help control that pelvis in space while they're squatting, they're going to be great. So you want to find drills like the feet up brace with hamstrings that I'm sure all of you guys, if your clients of mine, are familiar with, that increase sensation of those muscles while you're bracing. Next is tell them to find that bottom position of the squat, like I said, and try to maintain that at the top to sort of discourage them from anteriorly tilting. Another one is to assess hip function. So if they're just unable to get into a good degree of hip flexion, they're not going to be able to safely squat to depth without some compensation happening at the lower back. The reason you might want to do that secondary is because I think a lot of the time range of motion of the hip is sort of a slave to pelvic position. So first you want to teach them the sensation of an anteriorly and posteriorly tilted pelvis, help them find neutral, and then if they're still having problems, it might be because of hip immobility. And then the last step is just regress if necessary. Nobody needs to start in a low bar squat position. No one needs to start in a high bar squat position. In fact, I usually don't have people start with either one of those if I can help it. So being able to know your regressions and progressions and having a plan of action is paramount. So if we're talking about bracing drills, which is, I said, where you should start, for example, I'll start people in that feet up brace position to sort of teach them what to look for as far as what does bracing feel like in the easiest position possible, right? There's really no resistance. And then from there, progress them into that low bear plank position is usually my next go-to, because now you've added gravity into that same position where it's easy to maintain a stacked pelvic floor and diaphragm, a neutral pelvic position, and maintain that brace. And then from there, once they've got that sensation down, you can move into something like a counterbalance squat, which is really not that dissimilar from a low bear plank, except that you've now turned it sideways. If we're talking about squatting, I usually start people in that counterbalance squat position as their very first experience with squatting, because when that weight is distributed very far in front of them, people naturally allow their knees to track forward. They can keep their ribs down a little bit better and find a neutral pelvic position, and they usually don't anteriorly tilt when the weight is this far out in front of them. So from a counterbalance squat, you can progress. Usually a goblet squat is an easy one for people to maintain a great position. And then from there, you've got some options. So I like to go to a zombie squat, as some of you know, love, and or hate, which is a front squat without your hands. Or a Zercher squat is a great alternative. That's where it's just sitting in the elbows. From there, you can go into a front squat where that weight is still distributed forward. Or from there, you can go into a high bar squat. And then from there, and there only, you should probably go into a low bar squat. Once they've mastered that natural squatting pattern from having the weight out in front of them, then you can start to carry it over to having the weight further and further back behind them, where the weight is going to get naturally heavier and heavier and heavier because they can hinge it a little bit more. This video has gone on way longer than I wanted it to, but I hope it was informative, and please leave your questions and comments below. Keep training, guys, and just let me know how you're doing. It's a weird time out there. Hope you guys are all doing okay. All right.